Welcome back to another episode of Democracy Works. This week we are talking with Cynthia Miller-Idriss, who is a professor at American University and the author of a brand new book called Man Up, which looks at how misogyny is related to political extremism and how it can be detrimental to our democracy.
The execution of that power and who should hold it, that bleeds into things like reproductive rights, same-sex marriage rights, voting rights. When you start hearing people calling for one household, one vote, when you hear people arguing that women shouldn't have the right to vote.
Cynthia is a world-class scholar. She's actually been on this show before, but this book is very personal. She tells some really kind of heart-wrenching stories in the book and in the interview that I think will be relatable to some of you out there. And this is a very thought-provoking conversation about an issue that is in some ways as old as the human species itself, but has taken on a lot of new forms with social media and other technologies. So hope you enjoyed this one with Cynthia Miller-Idriss. So this book comes in part from the research that you've been doing for some time now, but also from your personal experience. I wonder if you could share a bit about that lane of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as a woman in the field, who has spent my whole career interviewing and studying boys and men who are violent or on the fringes of violent scenes, I had thought about gender. I thought about my own role as a young woman in particular when at the time I was doing interviews with young men in schools in Berlin. As an advantage because that it was a little bit different for me to be in conversation with them. It was maybe a little less threatening. It also was an advantage to not be German, for example, to be an outsider. And so I was an outsider in many ways, and I could ask them to explain things. So I did think about gender, and I thought about masculinity in particular, and the pressure that they felt to be, and the desire that they felt to be part of something bigger and better than themselves, a kind of brotherhood, sailor, soldier, warrior, rule breaker, rebel. I mean, I talked a lot about those tropes as they relate to being a young man and the readiness to be violent that they often describe. That's a one word in German, Gewaltbereit, which is really a very common description of what they felt they had to be in the world, is ready to be violent. Whether they were violent or not, they had to project the sense that they could be. And that was very much being a part of a young man for them. So I had thought a lot about that. And I had thought a lot about women's role in extremism. So trad wives on the more mainstream side, but also women who supported white supremacist extremist movements, QAnon, all kinds of things like that. But I had somehow never looked at how men view women, right? Or misogyny itself, the policing of gendered norms and expectations aside from masculinity itself. And so, it's surprising to me that I didn't do it. It's like my own blind spot in the field, maybe my own hesitation to look closely at something that also had affected me personally quite a bit over the course of my own career. So I opened the book with, an anecdote about something a lot of young women experience. And I wasn't even that young when it happened to me, in my 40s already, when a colleague tried to kiss me in an elevator at a conference. That's a common thing, surprisingly, that has happened to a lot of women I know. And when I pushed him away and he sort of said, "What kind of games are you playing?" I hopped out of the elevator and I called my sister, who said, "Your problem is you're too nice. You have to be more of a bitch." And so I start with that anecdote talking about this tension and what happens when you are more of a bitch. Some men get very, very angry in unpredictable ways. And so really using that anecdote as a way of talking about this navigation, even stories about my mom's experience, being in a generation that didn't have the legal right to open a bank account, right? So we have seen real progress in just 50 years, right? That's inconceivable. The idea, my mom went to the same university that I went to, and her father said he wouldn't pay for it because she was a girl. I can't imagine that, right? And it's unimaginable that she applied to go to Cornell because she said it was the only Ivy that would accept women at the time. And so, and the fact that she just soldiered through all of that, it was a really different experience than I had. I never had that feeling that my own career was held back in any way, that my own learning or work trajectory was changed. Except, challenges around being a working parent, but that I think a lot of people feel that. but not like what my mom went through, not like what previous generations had to fight through.
Yeah. Yeah, and the way that, individual actions can sort of scaffold onto one another, right, to lead
Exactly.
to something bigger. So yeah, that's thank you for including those stories, for sharing them so publicly. I think a lot of folks will resonate
Yeah.
with what you write. But moving from the realm of the personal into the political, to the extent that you can
Yeah.
separate those two, I suppose. But
Yes.
that's a whole other conversation.
Yes. Right.
You also write that the plot to kidnap, Gretchen Whitmer was an
Yeah.
influence for you. I remember we talked a lot about that on this show, sort of
Yeah.
as that was all unfolding. So what was that sort of lightning moment for you?
Yeah, I think I was super irritated at the time. And it turns out that being irritated is a good motivation to write a book. And that was one of two things that really pushed me over the edge of deciding I had to write the book because it had been percolating for a while. I saw that I had ignored it too much in my own career, my own work and writing. I felt like we're seeing rising misogyny online, documented since 2011. And so you're seeing these things percolate, the manosphere emerge,
Mhm.
the violent incels, the attacks on women spa workers in Atlanta. I mean, all of the kinds of things that were showing up on the violent end of the spectrum. And then we have this kidnapping and live streamed execution plot against the sitting governor that used extraordinarily misogynistic language in the ways that they talked about her. And in fact, the original title of this book was Just Grab the Bitch, which as the book, it got submitted in its final form with that. And I fought hard for the title. My editor fought hard for that title. And eventually the marketing department
Mhm.
dinged it. And for good reason, because they actually did a survey of um, independent booksellers who had very mixed views
Mhm.
on it and also felt that why are we centering the views of, the words of violent men? Let's not do that. And so in the end, I did like the idea of centering more of the messages that men get that can create those conditions. But in any case, one of the things that happened with that Gretchen Whitmer case is that in the actual trial, the defense attorneys described those words as just big talk and blowing off steam. So essentially dismissing them as locker room talk. So that was irritation number one. And the second one, I'll say faster, which is in the spring of 2021, not long after that case, after January 6th, the US government issued a new classification system for domestic violent extremism in which they really tried hard for good reasons to get away from the idea of far left and far left violent or far right violence. So they had a category of sort of identity based harms that include, both racial, white supremacist extremism kinds of things, but also animal rights extremism, environmental extremism. So issue driven and identity based. And then they had an anti government column, which includes anarchists and anti fascists, but also sovereign citizens and unlawful militias. So really trying to create these categories. Then they had this category, like, you can't make this up if you tried. It's a category called all other extremisms. It really says something like extremisms related to gender, sexuality, and religion, which are like the three.
That's like everything.
Oh, and it's also the three fastest growing areas like anti-LGBTQ, misogyny, and violent incels and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are like, they're just going so fast and they don't even get a category. Like the animal rights extremists who had 6 attacks in like 14 years with no lethality, like they get a category, which means there's like expertise tied to it. There's like FBI divisions and hearings, right? Like these things
And
matter. These categories
yeah,
matter.
funding, right? I
Yeah, the
mean, yeah.
potential funding, but
Yeah.
and like divisions of law enforcement that are assigned to it.
Mhm.
So all other extremisms like that. So that became the title of the first section of the book, which is called Othering Gender. Like we can't just stick it in the other category of the gender and sexuality and think that we're going to be able to take it seriously as a mobilizer to violence and to violent extremism. So that was the final. I was like, that's it. I have to write the book.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was surprised to read when you talked about misogyny as a bridge builder of sorts for bringing
Yeah.
people of color into what we
Yeah.
traditionally think of as a white movement.
Yes.
More about that connection.
Yeah, I mean, there's two separate ways that misogyny becomes intersectional. One is, as you're saying, I mean, there's something called the Black Manosphere. We have a project right now in partnership with a team at Howard University, my research lab, that's looking at issues of hate as it gets fomented on historically Black colleges and universities, but also other predominantly Black institutions like community colleges. where you often have anti-LGBTQ issues happening, but also sort of misogyny being directed toward Black women who far outnumber Black men on campuses. And there's that whole ecosystem online. And so misogynoir, as Black feminist writers have described for a long time, is this intersection of misogyny and racism that's directed at Black women and more broadly at women of color. So you have that whole type of thing happening. But you also have the fact that misogyny is an entry point to lots of other forms of hate. And it's very accessible at a moment when influencers who peddle very misogynistic ideas for subscription content and, products that they're selling have approval ratings among teenage boys of as high as 20%. And so you have very accessible content, often accessed through innocuous ways like fitness or dating advice or financial advice. You land on these influencers. You find this very anti-feminist, misogynistic content that scapegoats women for the very real problems that men face. Let's be clear about that. There are real crises of loneliness, etc. But then it's very easy to introduce scientific racism. Once you're talking about like brain size, right? You start to see scientific racism creep in. You start to see anti-Semitism at this intersection because there's this ridiculous part of the conspiracies that says, well, like feminists are bad, but they couldn't have done this on their own because they're not smart enough. So it must be the Jews, right? And so it's the conspiracy, right? So the Jews are actually the ones in charge of the feminists who are causing the problems for boys and men. So you get this tight intersection of, and so one of the things we've talked to about in our anti-Semitism work on the prevention side in my lab is like, it does no good to build walls around Jewish communities or other minority communities to protect them if misogyny just tunnels right underneath and delivers, the harm anyway. You have to also address misogyny, which is, in some ways the biggest and most ubiquitous form because it's, directed against half the population, plus gender policing for boys and men as well.
Right. And so the goal of all this, or one of the goals is not to, get rid of women or these
Right.
don't necessarily hate women, but it's more about control. Is that
exactly right? In fact, another anecdote I have, because there's so many, you just can't make this stuff up. Like the conclusion I open with an anecdote when I was talking to a funder who I have a ton of respect for, who does really good work in this field in anti-Semitism. And I was talking to the funder about the new book I'm writing on misogyny. And he said, misogyny? But that doesn't have anything to do with white supremacist extremism. But and he said, then it's not as if these guys want to eliminate women from the face of the earth. Right. And so I thought, okay, if that's the standard by which we have to judge problematic behavior, right? We're not counting exploitation. We're not counting control or coercion. We're not counting abuse or violence, right? It's just elimination. Then we have a problem because all of these other forms of harm and exploitation and erasure and punishment and control are also problematic, even if, yes, white supremacist men need white women to reproduce, society and have white babies with. So it's, part of what I argue is that exploitation in the form of child sexual exploitation, as we see like neo-Nazis constantly getting arrested for child pornography, for example, sex trafficking, as we see white supremacist groups often getting involved in being arrested for drug trafficking, but not for sex trafficking charges, even though the DEA says those always go hand in hand, essentially. So, those kinds of things, the goal here is to shed light on it, to call at least for more data collection and for more awareness of it, but also acknowledging that there are a wider variety of harms than just elimination or segregation and separation are not the only things that can be done at the hands of extremists and of violent men in this case who are enacting harm.
Yeah. Yeah, and this idea of control makes me think about some of the ways that these ideas have made their way into the political mainstream,
Yes.
right? In the sort of the post-Roe landscape, and I'm thinking about people like J.D. Vance who espouse a very particular kind of masculinity. So, what are the ramifications of this ideology, this world coming into our politics and for our democracy and the institutions that comprise it?
Yeah. Well, when we're talking about a kind of defense of the patriarchy, if you will, right, which is the patriarchy is a power structure that, ultimately that gives more power and control to men at the hands of other men and who don't adhere to the norms, and women. And that defense of the patriarchy is done through kind of sexist attitudes, but also through misogynistic actions and behaviors. And those are kind of the law enforcement mechanisms that I'm talking about here, that are defending the patriarchy with either legal means or social norms and control, and attempts to belittle, dehumanize, or enact violence against women and the LGBTQ community, and in some cases, boys and men who don't adhere to those norms, through bullying, through slurs like "you throw like a girl," or gender policing that puts boys and men in their place if they don't adhere, right, to these kind of macho norms. All of that, one, is a defense of the gender binary, right? Really trying to make sure that we adhere to very fixed ideas of men and women, and that there are very clear rules for being men and women and boys and girls that have to be adhered to and have to be policed. And that filters into an idea that of submissiveness and control, of power, and of the execution of that power and who should hold it, that bleeds into things like reproductive rights, same-sex marriage rights, voting rights. When you start hearing people calling for one household, one vote, when you hear people arguing that women shouldn't have the right to vote, and that go back again to what my mom faced, and women of that generation, even privileged white women who went to college, right, had no right to open a bank account or a credit card without their husband until, in her case, she had 3 children already in the mid 70s. So those are the kinds of rights that we take, in all honesty, my generation takes completely for granted. I can't even imagine a world where I couldn't open a bank account without a man's signature. But it was not that long ago that was the case. And so those are the kinds of rights and the legal restrictions that are forms of control. But there's also social forms of control that I'm talking about in this book.
Yeah, and on that idea of kind of the economics of it all, I have to say, as I was reading this, I thought a lot about the connection to globalization and the push toward white collar work away from blue collar types of jobs. I went to high school in the early 2000s, and at that point, like if you went to the Botech, as we called it, like you were a loser, right? You were
Yeah,
at the
right.
bottom of the social status, and I mean, I would think that like that foments some kind of feeling of wanting revenge or feeling like you're
Yeah.
at a loss or something like that. And so when Andrew Tate comes along, it's like, oh, he's speaking to those
Yeah, and
feelings.
Andrew Tate, he opens every single video saying men are suffering and I'm the only one who will talk about it. And to be honest, he was right for a long time. Like, I think we're getting better at talking about the problems that men and boys face, but you do have to, and I tried really hard in this book to emphasize that these are real problems. Sometimes they're perceived grievances, but there are also real problems. Men have 3/4 of the deaths of despair in this country, which is suicides, overdoses, deaths by alcohol. 40% of college attendance now, or graduation rather, there's massive loss of traditionally male jobs. So when you're talking about that kind of economics of that, what it intersects with, though, is a culture of masculinity, right? That is sometimes called man box culture, that says that men are failures if they're not providers and protectors. And if that provider role in that culture is then removed, it makes sense that the protector role, which is a little bit more violent or ready to be violent role, right? That idea of dominance and aggression as hallmarks of masculinity being a part of that is going to surge. And that's what we've seen. And so, but instead of addressing the fact that the provider role, A, is part of an imposed cultural norm that maybe was never fair to begin with, and B, is being removed because of the loss of traditionally male jobs without structural replacement or opportunities to retrain in careers that are thriving, and sometimes in part because of gendered norms about things like nursing or caregiving, where there's surges in hiring, but men are not following in scale. So, that those things are real, but instead of addressing the structural things, we're scapegoating instead women feminists and others for taking our place, for making it too hard for men, or for going too far, right? This idea that women's rights have gone too far, which like surprising percentage of men in this country believe now. I don't have it in front of me, but it's cited in the book. It's like half in some cases of the demographic.
Could they, like, name what specifically those rights are, do you think? Or is it just women's rights just as kind of a
Yeah,
general
I think
vibe?
I think in general, it's this sense that circulates online, often that, women are getting a leg up, are getting ahead, they
Mhm,
get an advantage, everything's easier for them, they're, like, more likely to get the interview, that they get promoted, that it's everything's hard, and I've heard people say this, like, educated, well-educated, informed people say, "My son can't get a job because all
mhm,
these other people are in line ahead of him," basically, and I think
mhm,
that that sense, even if statistically it's still actually not true when you look at pay rates, etcetera, there's a strong sense that white boys and men are
mhm,
discriminated against now in the job market, and that kind of narrative at the hands of feminist immigrants, people of color, others, and so that's the kind of scapegoating, and then this idea that women's rights have gone too far, does come on the heel of decades of girls can code, girls on the run, like
mhm,
trying to promote girls' access to things where they had been excluded, while not thinking about how do we maybe capitalize on helping boys also um, have opportunities to experience a fuller range of human emotions and capacity and focus on their well-being and not just on their sense sometimes they get, as I've heard from boys and men my whole career, that they feel like people see them as inherently dangerous or bad.
mm. Well, yeah, and on that kind of the boys and men problem, I'm thinking a lot about Richard Reeves, who started the
Yes,
Institute for Boys and Men, and that
exactly.
kind that gets some eye rolls
Yeah.
sometimes, right? And people are like, "We've been talking about boys and men for time immemorial. Why do we need to kind of focus on that?"
I get that too. People get angry sometimes in the audience, women in particular, when I start saying this because they say, like, well, and it's true, women are still paid less. They still, receive the bulk of violence directed in sexual assaults. And, not to boys that are also bullied and harmed at the hands of older men and their families, but not at the same rates of girls in terms of sexual assault, the likelihood of being raped in your life, the safety issue, the unequal pay issue, the lack of opportunities, the challenges of caregiving, of no parental leave, to speak of, the cost of childcare, all of which drives women out of the labor market at higher rates than men at key points in their career. All of those things are true, and you can still have an emerging problem of boys and men that shows they're backsliding and going down, even if it doesn't mean things are worse for them than for women. It's like a both and problem, not an either or problem. And so
Right.
that's what I try to say.
Yeah. Well, and it seems to me that the solutions then need to be both and as well.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't. I mean, it's, Richard Reeves, Center, Equimundo, like these organizations that have been really focusing on boys and men's wellness. Governor Newsom in California just passed an executive order that has real effort. And I think in Maryland too, there's new efforts on to look at boys and men. I mean, those solutions have to be there. They shouldn't take the place of efforts to promote, protect, and safeguard girls and women, particularly at a moment when we're also seeing the highest rates of online misogyny and things like sex toys being thrown at WNBA players during basketball games, right? Like this is there that problem hasn't gone away, and in fact, in documented ways has also gotten worse. But those solutions have to address both types of problems.
Yeah. What about on the media front? As we've discussed, the manosphere, these ideas resonate and they're very financially
Yeah.
viable. Like what? I don't expect you to have the be all end all for this, but are there any examples you've come across or any trends from your research that show a path for how to get a different version of masculinity and frankly, feminism and femininity
Yeah.
out there in a way that's as compelling or coming
Yeah.
close to being compelling as the
Think there's
manosphere?
like some very good efforts. So there's a burgeoning men's wellness world out there that it's doing incredible work. Places like the Good Men Project, who I partner with in my lab from time to time, and other men's wellness worlds that have taken a strengths based approach to men's wellness, but also looking at things like what men have lost by living in this man box culture and what does it mean to try to build connection because men get isolated. So Mark Green is running this walking talking men program now that's picking up across the country that is really literally just men going for walks together in the evening and having more intimate conversations, because the research shows men lose that kind of intimacy around puberty because of the fear of being portrayed as gay if they are being intimately close or emotionally close to their male friends. And that's a huge loss. And then you have this tremendous loneliness data among young men saying, 25% of men under 30 saying they don't have a single friend. 50% of American men saying that their online lives are more rewarding than their offline lives. So that kind of stuff has to happen. On the girls and women's side, there's a couple of different things that I think are awesome. Like, one is this burgeoning world of women's sports bars, right? So for one example, and I'm doing an event with one of the women's sports bars later this fall as part of the book tour. And it turns out there's a lot of interest in the women's sports world on these issues because they face so much misogyny. So a lot of former women pro athletes who I've been in conversation with over the course of the last several weeks to engage in these types of conversations with up and coming girls teams and athletes. And I think, we've seen a lot of like women's empowerment marketing on the part of like Dove or corporations like Nike. And one of the things I hope to push is calling on them, not just for women's empowerment funding and approaches, but also for protection of women, right? And girls. Like, how do we combat this kind of misogyny and not just say like, you can be anything you want. And then guess what? You're going to have to face like rape threats and stalking and harassment online as an athlete. Or femicide, like the Kenyan marathoners, when they go home. I mean, there's just terrible consequences to empowering women without also finding ways to protect and safeguard them and change the culture in which violence against women seems perfectly acceptable to a lot of men.
Sure. You can't empower your way through things. It seems to me but that is a scapegoat, maybe just as much as on the, what we talked about on the male side of things.
Yes.
But the last thing I want to ask you about, I know that your lab does a lot of work with schools and trying to equip educators and parents to talk about these issues. Are you doing any work there on these topics?
Yeah, we do a lot of education. And what I find is that often the people who approach me first at the podium afterward are boys who are so eager to have a conversation or to have space for a conversation about, as one of them described to me when he asked me what I thought people didn't know about boys and men after all the interviews I've done. And I turned it on him. I said, what do you think people don't know about boys and men? And he said, I don't think people realize what it's like to suddenly discover that the world sees you as dangerous, right? And then a girl spoke up and said, well, I don't think boys know what it's like to suddenly realize the world sees you as a sexual object. And so I was like, maybe the two of you should be in conversation, right? But this is why I love it, because they just like, they don't have these opportunities. So a lot of what I do is encourage schools and teachers to integrate conversations about online worlds and content and gendered content, including things like violent porn, which we know is having terrible outcomes for all kinds of things like choking behaviors, asphyxiation, higher stroke rates among women under age 40 now, into health education classes, into digital media literacy classes. And we also do a lot of work with parents. So we have a guide with the Southern Poverty Law Center called Not Just a Joke, Preventing and Understanding Gender and Sexuality-Based Bigotry. There's an abridged version of that guide in the back of my book, along with all the resource lists. And those are free. All those tools are free. And we have work on higher ed campuses. We're doing work now in Kenya and Jordan and Canada as well in my lab on issues of gender-based violence and the connection to violent extremism and issues of misogyny in e-gaming and esports clubs on campuses. So there's a wide variety of work. I would just tell people we get funders to pay for it, and then it's all free to the public after we've tested it. So it's at www.perrilresearch.com. People can find those tools, download them, share them with their communities, and hopefully find a space to have more conversations about this.
Great. Yeah. Well, we'll link to all of that in the show notes and to your book as well. And I hope that our listeners who are local here to Penn State will come and see you in person at the end of October. We'll put all those details in the episode notes as well.
But it's my home state, as you know, so yes, I'm always happy to come back. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Cynthia, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Jenna. I really appreciate it.
All right, I promised I would tell this story quickly, so I'm going to tell it quickly. But it immediately came into my mind as I was reading this book. So I'm sure you've heard of a no-hitter in baseball. Well, there's something that's even more rare, which is called a perfect game. And a perfect game means that the pitcher, not only there's no hits, but there's no walks and there's no errors. And I think there's 24 in the history of Major League Baseball. That's how rare it is, right? And it was like, oh, I don't know, 2010, let's say. I think that's right, actually. This pitcher Galarraga had 8 innings of a perfect game and 2 outs in the ninth, right? And there's a play at first base, and Jim Joyce is the umpire, and he's a very well respected umpire, and he called him safe when he was out. It was obvious on replay that he got the call wrong, right? And so he ruined this guy's perfect game, and completely his fault. All right. Jim Joyce finds out, sees the evidence, and he not only goes before the press and says, this was my fault. This was the most important play of my life, and I crapped the bed, and I have no excuse. And then he went and talked to Galarraga, man to man, and apologized. And I actually, when I was coaching baseball, I told that story because I said, that's what a man does. And that's what I think of when I think of man up. And I get that, there's a lot going on there, and baseball is a very guy oriented world. But I'm not entirely happy about creating a world in which this concept is no longer viable when you can't say something like man up. So what I would say is that we have operative right now a world in which man up has come to mean something almost pathetic. It's not manning up, but that doesn't mean the concept is illegitimate. That's what I want to say.
All right. So I'm not going to disagree with you, Chris, but you
Mm,
are getting my hackles up a little bit with the story.
good. All right,
Right.
good.
Um, and I think that maybe what I'm reacting to is the same thing that has happened to many linguistic concepts, right? Which is, I think, what you're alluding to. The very notion of what it is to man up has become so conflated
Yeah.
with violence, with anti-feminist attitudes, with a way of behaving and functioning that isn't dignified and honorable, right? I mean, I think, the Jim Joyce story is a brilliant story of compassion, of owning your mistakes, of taking care of other people, of taking responsibility for your own actions. So one, I don't think it has to be inherently male,
No,
right?
it doesn't.
Right, but I also when you it's just the term, right? As soon as you say it that other way, I'm like, "Oh, I don't know, man." Right? Like it doesn't feel right. And I think that may be at the root of a lot of the things that Cynthia is trying to talk about, which is
Yeah.
that we have kind of bastardized masculinity in the US to such a way.
The other thing I wanted to say about this story is, can you conceive of a circumstance in which Donald Trump would behave this way? When he'd say, that's on me. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. It's out of the question. And so part of the problem here is that the concept of masculinity that people see in Donald Trump is just, to my mind, farcical. It is so far off the mark that it's like, I don't know what concept you're creating in your head. It's not just that he won't own up. He won't accept responsibility of any kind. He won't tell the truth. He wears makeup. I mean, where do you stop with this? This is not someone that you would say, "Oh yeah, that's what a man does." And so the idea that that I guess what I would say is at the core of the concept as it is operative in much of American culture right now is so far off the mark that maybe we do have to kill it because that's the only thing we can do. But it is just a categorical mistake to call this that kind of behavior manly. That's all I would say.
And again, I would just expand it, right? It's also not the definition of a good leader, right? I mean, so
Yes.
it's a core crisis of leadership, independent of what gender you assign, right, to the behavior. And I guess my challenge is, in some ways, what Cynthia then offers as solutions, which is the yes and problem, right? I think that we can acknowledge crises of masculinity. I think we can acknowledge problems with a lack of clear role models behaving, in a kind of historical way of kind of, I don't know, being a good man. I'm
Yeah,
still
yeah, I get it. I
I'm
get it.
like trying to wrap my head around it. Um, but it doesn't in any way negate the harms that are still being experienced by women, and the way in which, these kind of faltering masculinities are still harmful. And we started to talk about it in the beginning, but you know we're seeing this kind of decline, right, of male power, and we see the same thing with white power in the United States, and that decline is what is causing rises of populism and rises of different ideologies and attitudes, and we see this happening. But I think Cynthia makes a really core point that even on the decline, we still have gross gender inequities, incredible amounts of violence perpetrated against women. I thought her closing story about female athletes was so telling. And that's because I've been really excited recently about the rise of women's sports, right? Of female athletes,
Mhm.
WNBA stories and things like that.
Yep.
But then to hear Cynthia tell the story, right? These athletes are still disproportionately affected by sexual assault, harassment, death threats. And so they're paying a huge cost for the kind of first mover advantage of being the group of individuals that are ushering in this new excitement around sports, and paying the price for all the increased notoriety and attention that those sports are getting. And so that's kind of my yes and moment. It's like, I think we can talk about threats to masculinity. I think, many of the statistics about the proportion of men that are experiencing, or the proportion of the American population that is male that's experiencing deaths of despair and things like that, are shocking and, right, and deeply
Yeah.
troubling. But it still, in my head, doesn't offset this other component, which is that we've got a crisis of women too, right? And women
Hmm.
are still disproportionately affected by domestic violence, yeah, and just violence in general in society. I think that fear is real. Uh,
I absolutely agree with that.
and
Anyway.
I loved the call for yes and programming, right? So I think that one of the things that we can do relatively easily is think about the types of programs and the types of processes that support everybody, right? So you put a lot of energy and resources into girl empowerment programs, women in STEM, and things like that. But we can also but that doesn't mean that we have to do that at the exclusion of programming that addresses loneliness in boys and young men, gendered male
Hmm.
content.
Hmm. And it's
Um,
all driven by money. The fact that it's undermining a child's life, well, that's too bad, but I only have 4 billion, I need 5 or whatever. I'm absolutely you know, on the soapbox, but it does just shock me how indifferent people are to creating this world that they know is harming children. And not only that, they're like trying to figure out how to harm children better, how to be more effective at it, right? And that just blows my mind.
and we will have so much time this season to get into our critiques of late stage capitalism.
Well, let's hope so, because there's nothing else to talk about, right? All right. Anyway, um, so thank you to Cynthia once again. We look forward to welcoming her on campus. Thanks to Jenna for yet another great interview. I'm Chris Beam.
And I'm Cyan Loyal.
Thanks for listening.